man who came to check on me. This all happened during my first winter break after starting college. I'd come back home to my parents' place for a few weeks, mostly to relax, see some old friends, and decompress after a pretty stressful semester. Things had gotten intense with exams and projects, so I was looking forward to just taking it easy for a while. But a few days after Christmas, I got sick. At first, I just thought it was the flu, the usual stuff, fever, chills, body aches. It turned out to be one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, even though nothing about it was supernatural or out of this world. It was just real. I'll try to explain everything as clearly as I can because even now, when I think about it, the way it all unfolded still feels unnerving. It started on December 27th. I woke up with a sore throat and a pounding headache. I was cold, but also sweating in patches under my blankets. My body ached, like I'd been hit by a truck or run a marathon I hadn't trained for. I remember dragging myself out of bed, wincing as I moved, and heading to the kitchen. My mom was putting away groceries when I saw her. "Aaron, you look terrible," she said, coming closer. "Just some flu, I think," I shrugged, trying to sound normal, but coughing anyway. She gave me a glass of water and a few pills, then told me to rest. I decided to stay in my childhood bedroom, which still had the same wallpaper and old posters I'd put up years ago. Familiar surroundings helped a bit, but mostly I felt drained. Over the next couple of days, the fever spiked and dipped. I was shivering in the morning and sweating through the night. I could barely eat, and even drinking water felt like a chore. My body was heavy and stiff, and every muscle ached. By the 29th, I was mostly confined to my bed. My parents were at work most days, and my older sister was visiting friends, so I was home alone a lot. My phone was nearby, but honestly, I barely had the energy to talk. On the morning of the 30th, I woke up soaked with sweat again. I must have been burning 100 degrees in my sleep. I sat up slowly, feeling weak, nausea twisting my stomach. I had this dizzy wave wash over me, like the world was tipping sideways. I looked out the window. The sky was gray and overcast, the bare branches of trees scratching at the dull light like nervous fingers. My neighborhood was quiet. No kids outside, no cars speeding, just the distant hum of a heater or two. I reached for my phone to text my sister, but saw I had no messages. That was normal, though. I wasn't exactly chatty. Then I heard a strange sound. It was a quiet knock on the front door. "Hello?" I called, my voice croaky. No answer. I figured maybe a neighbor dropping something off or the mailman. But it was odd because the knock wasn't urgent or loud, more like someone tapping a finger slowly. I wrapped myself in the blanket and shuffled to the door. Looking outside through the peephole, I saw a man standing just beyond the porch light. He was wearing a long dark coat and a knit cap pulled low over his forehead. His face was partly in shadow, but I saw he had a beard and glasses. I didn't recognize him. I thought about ignoring it, but something made me unlock the door a crack and open it just enough to peek out. "Can I help you?" I croaked. The man smiled, not a friendly smile, more like the kind you give when you're sure you have the upper hand. "Hey, I live down the street. I just saw your car here all day. Thought I'd check in. Heard you were sick. Wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, his voice calm. I hesitated, throat dry and raw. "Thanks, but I'm fine. Just resting," I said carefully. He nodded slowly. "All right, I won't bother you then. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." There was something about how he said that line, too rehearsed, too smooth, that made me uncomfortable. I closed the door and locked it quickly. For a while, I tried to shrug it off. It was weird, sure, but maybe the guy was just a concerned neighbor. My fever was high, and my mind was foggy, so I didn't think much about it afterward. I went back to bed, pulling my blanket tight around me. But then, about an hour later, I heard that tapping sound again. This time, it was soft but persistent, someone tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, heart hammering. The bedroom window looked out onto the backyard, which was fenced in, but still, I slowly lifted my head and peered toward the window. It was the same man. He was tapping on the glass with his knuckles, looking inside at me with those cold eyes. He gave me a slow wave. I pulled the blanket over my head and stayed perfectly still. After a few minutes, I summoned the courage to look again, but he was gone. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I told my parents what had happened when they came home from work. My mom was alarmed. "Did you call the police?" she asked. I shook my head. I wasn't sure. I mean, he didn't do anything besides scare me. Dad came over and inspected the door and window locks. I'll check the house after dinner, okay? We'll make sure you're safe. I nodded, but I felt shaky all day. Later, after they left for a quick grocery run, I tried to rest. The fever was worse, and I felt like my body was melting into the mattress. Then the knocks started again. First a tap on the door, then a rhythmic knocking like someone was testing how awake I was, how aware. I didn't answer. The tapping stopped, but then a low sigh or humming sound came from outside. I couldn't tell for sure. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'm just trying to help you." I stared at the screen, numb with fear. My hand shook as I typed back, "Who are you?" No reply. I debated calling the police then, but I was too weak and scared to make decisions. That night, I barely closed my eyes. Every creak of the house or shifting shadow made me tense. Around midnight, I heard the front door open softly, the creak of the hinge unmistakable. Panic flooded through me. I was too sick and weak to move fast, but I tried to call out. "Hello? Who is that?" No answer. I got up gingerly, gripping the bedside table to keep balance. I thought about grabbing my dad's hunting knife from the kitchen, but the thought of moving through the pitch-dark house was terrifying. I looked toward the door. There was a silhouette standing in the hallway, half in shadow. My blood ran cold. "Please, leave," I whispered. The man stepped forward just a few feet away now. I could see his face clearly, the beard, the rim of his glasses. Again he smiled. "I just wanted to see if you need help." I wanted to scream, but my voice cracked. My phone buzzed again. I hastily checked it. A new message. "Don't be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." Neither of those things was reassuring. Something in me snapped. I grabbed the remote for the TV and threw it hard at him. He ducked and moved past me quickly, disappearing toward the kitchen. I stumbled toward the stairs and yelled for my parents. At that moment, my dad and mom burst through the front door. They'd come back early. Dad saw the man in the kitchen and shouted. The intruder froze, then dropped the backpack he'd had over one shoulder and raised his hands. Dad moved toward him and pinned him to the wall until police arrived. It was a relief, but also surreal. The man was caught, identified as a local guy with a history of breaking into houses, especially when people were home alone. He wasn't armed, but he's admitted to trying to find vulnerable people who wouldn't fight back. The police told me he had a twisted way of thinking, convincing himself he was helping, but obviously that was nonsense. Now, reflecting on all this, I realize how being sick left me completely exposed. Normally I'm someone who trusts his instincts and can act quickly, but that fever made me sluggish. The aches sapped my strength. Just the simple act of standing was difficult. I was home alone, sick, and at my most vulnerable. When the man showed up, I wasn't just fighting off a common cold. I was fighting to keep safe from something far more dangerous. And what scared me the most was how close he got before I even realized the real threat. How the sickness had sapped the usual protective walls we build around ourselves. Being sick isn't just about feeling weak. It can strip away your sense of safety. And that's when danger finds its way in. The pharmacy delivery. When I first moved out of my parents' house, I felt like I was finally stepping into the real world. I was 22, just starting my third year at college, and I'd rented a small apartment about 15 minutes from campus. It wasn't anything fancy, a one-bedroom with thin walls, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that always seemed to have some leak. But it was mine. Most days I liked being independent. I liked not having to answer to anyone other than myself. Then 1 week late in the spring, I got sick, one of the worst sinus infections I've ever had. It started with a headache and a scratchy throat, which I tried to shrug off at first. I kept going to classes, sipping mug after mug of tea, and trying to breathe through the fog in my head. By the third day, though, I could barely get out of bed. My head was pounding as if it had a drum inside, my nose was swollen shut, and every breath felt heavy and labored. I was dizzy when I stood up, my limbs weak and weighted. I knew I had to see a doctor, but the thought of dragging myself out into the world felt impossible. So I called the campus health center. They were busy but managed to squeeze me in for a telehealth appointment that evening. The doctor on the other end of the video call was kind but concerned. He said it wasn't urgent, but prescribed antibiotics and recommended rest, hydration, and over-the-counter meds for pain. The only problem, I had no energy or car to get my prescriptions filled. That's when I thought about the delivery service the local pharmacy advertised. They said they'd deliver medications right to your door for free if you lived within 5 miles. I called them from my couch. The woman on the phone was polite, asked for my card info to charge the medication copay, and said the delivery driver would be there between 5 and 7 p.m. The wait was brutal. I hovered by the front door, sneezing and sniffling, tissues piling up on my coffee table. I wasn't paying close attention to time. Honestly, the headache and fever made my sense of hours and minutes fuzzy, but I knew it was getting close to 7 when I heard a knock. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there, maybe late 30s, average build, wearing a faded baseball cap and a blue jacket with the pharmacy's logo on the breast pocket. He was holding a small white paper bag. I asked, "You're from the pharmacy?" He smiled, nodded. "Yeah, I've got your meds here. Can I come in? Need to make sure you get them properly. The doctor said some of those pills can interact with the ones you're already on." It made sense. At least it did in my delirious state. I rarely let strangers into my apartment, but between the headache and congestion, I felt a little disoriented. Maybe it was rude to say no, so I stepped aside to let him in. The first thing I noticed as he came in was the faint smell of cigarette smoke on his coat. The moment my face mask was off, I started coughing hard into my sleeve. He handed me the bag, then started talking in a low, casual voice, like we were old friends. He asked questions about my other medications, any allergies, and if I was taking anything else not prescribed. I felt overwhelmed trying to focus, but I answered as best I could. The whole thing was making my head feel heavier, like gravity was pressing down. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and said he'd write down a schedule for me, explaining when to take each pill. That's when things started to feel off. He wasn't writing on pharmacy stationery, just some cheap notebook paper. His handwriting was sloppy, and he mixed up some medicine names I knew, like cetirizine spelled wrong, and generic names that didn't make sense. When I asked about it, he shrugged awkwardly and said the pharmacy was switching suppliers, so sometimes the names or doses changed. I wanted to ask more questions, but each time I tried to speak up, my throat burned worse, and I lost my train of thought. Suddenly, the room felt too warm, too close. My vision got blurry. "I'll stay a minute," he said. "Make sure you're okay." That was when I should have told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I stooped down to grab a box of tissues from the coffee table and resumed blowing my nose. He settled onto my couch, the bag of meds resting on his knee. The clock ticked loudly. I never heard him move, but suddenly he was right beside me, close enough that I could hear the rasp in his breath. He handed me a bottle of pills, one I didn't recognize, and said, "Take this with water, it'll help clear your head." I hesitated for a split second, then reached into the bag and found a half-full plastic water bottle on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I popped the pill into my mouth and swallowed with a gulp. Within minutes, I felt dizzy in a different way, more detached. The room swayed, my pulse slowed. My eyes darted to the man, trying to read his expression. He was still calm, watching me intently. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," I whispered, voice cracking. I wanted to leave the apartment. I wanted to slam the door and lock it, but my limbs felt weak and strange, as if they weren't quite mine. His voice was soothing, and oddly I stopped fighting. Then, somewhere outside, a car door slammed loudly. A man's head snapped toward the window. "Looks like company," he muttered. I didn't have time to react before I heard sirens and a harsh voice calling out, "Sir, stay where you are." 2 police officers were at the doorway. The man froze, had a tip about a suspicious person in this building. One officer said. I blinked, overwhelmed and confused. The man turned beet red. "You're under arrest for impersonating a pharmacy employee, trespassing, and possession of certain controlled substances," the officer said. After the police sorted everything out, confirmed I'd called to order meds just a few hours earlier, ran the driver's logs, and checked nearby pharmacies. It turned out this man had no connection to the pharmacy whatsoever. He'd used a stolen uniform jacket and fake IDs. The pills I took were a mix of actual antibiotics and other drugs he'd grabbed on the street. He'd been targeting sick or vulnerable people living alone. I was checked at the hospital, made sure no lasting damage was done. The police promised to keep me updated. The man was charged and held on multiple counts. It's strange looking back. I was sick, miserable, and isolated. I think that's what made me so easy to fool. When the man showed up, I was desperate for help. I didn't question his odd behavior, the bad handwriting, the weird names on the paper. I was just too tired, too fuzzy-headed to fight back. Being sick stripped me of my usual skepticism and made me vulnerable in a way I hadn't realized. I tell people this story now because I want them to understand that sometimes the worst danger isn't a shadow in the night or a ghost story. Sometimes it's the quiet moments when you let your guard down, feeling weak and alone, and exactly then someone steps in pretending to help. And you don't notice the warning signs until it's nearly too late. The fever dream. It started with just a cold, a runny nose and a tickle in my throat the night before. But by the next morning, everything had flipped. I was 17, in my senior year of high school, and I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My whole body ached. I had chills even under a thick blanket. My throat was raw, and the dizziness made it hard to stand. Mom took my temperature, and it was over 102. She debated calling urgent care, but I insisted I was fine. Both of my parents work full-time, and I was used to managing myself at home by then. I told her I just needed to rest, and she left for work with strict instructions to call her if I felt worse. I stayed in my room all day, mostly lying in bed under a pile of blankets, occasionally sitting up to take sips of water or cough into a ragged tissue. Between the fever and the aches, I slipped in and out of sleep, but mostly it felt like a weird fog. I wasn't hallucinating exactly, but the world had a strange, blurry quality that made everything feel both distant and close at the same time. I'm trying to remember things exactly how they happened. It's hard to separate what was real and what was just the fever messing with my head. When you're sick like that, everything slows down, even time. You think you're drifting, stuck inside your own mind. At some point, maybe late morning, I heard a noise downstairs. It was faint, barely audible over the ticking clock and the hum of the heater. Like a door creaking open, but I was pretty out of it and told myself it was the house settling, or maybe Mom coming in early. I didn't get up to check. Later, I heard it again. This time it was more distinct. Footsteps, soft, but definitely footsteps, slow, deliberate, from the front door area, moving toward the kitchen. That's when it got weird. My mind kept telling me it was just a dream. I shook my head, trying to clear the fuzziness. It was impossible. I could hear something. I wasn't imagining it. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt like sandpaper, and even breathing was exhausting. I wrapped my face in the blanket, trying to block it out, but the footsteps kept moving. I heard them stop near the back door, and then a pause. Silence, except for the slow, ragged sound of my own breathing. When I finally dared to peek, there was no one there. The door was closed, just like I'd left it. I told myself again it was a fever nightmare, but then I noticed. The back door lock was unlocked. I'm pretty sure I locked it that morning before Mom left. My heart started racing, even though I was weak as hell. I debated calling Mom, but my phone was downstairs, and getting up felt like climbing a mountain. I stayed put, waiting for her call at noon. I tried to convince myself the unlocked door was from last night, or maybe Dad leaving early. I'd even opened the door a crack that morning for the trash guy, because I didn't think it'd be a big deal. But something about those footsteps stuck in my gut. The way they paused, like someone had heard me breathing upstairs, and the door, it was unlocked, definitely unlocked, even though I was sure I'd secured it. I decided I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed, feeling lightheaded. My legs shook when I stood, but I managed to shuffle into my room's mirror and stared at myself. Pale as hell, my eyes glassy. I didn't look like myself. Careful not to make noise, I crept downstairs, gripping the railing. At the bottom, the house was silent except for the quiet tick of the wall clock. I crossed the kitchen and the back door. It looked normal, but unlocked. That's when I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time from the front door. Faster, closer. The dog was asleep on the couch and didn't even stir. I had this collision of emotions. Fear, confusion, but also a weird sort of numbness. Who would be here? The neighborhood was quiet these days, and why would they just wander in? I went to check the front door. It was slightly ajar. Now my heart was pounding loud enough that I thought it might give me away. I wanted to scream, to wake the neighbors, call 911, but I was barely able to stand, still dizzy and cold. I backed into the hall and dialed 911 with shaky fingers from the landline. It took everything to hold the receiver steady as I spoke. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice answered. I think someone's in my house. I whispered, voice cracking. I'm sick and I don't know what to do. Stay on the phone. Are you safe where you are? I'm upstairs, but... The footsteps started again, this time from the basement stairs, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. Keep calm. Has anyone touched anything? Do you see anyone? I didn't answer. The footsteps were getting closer, a few seconds between each. Lucas, stay on the line and stay quiet. Police are on the way. I barely heard the voice through my haze. Then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Suddenly, the basement door creaked. I closed my eyes and waited. Then a voice from below. Lucas, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean to scare you. It was a man's voice, familiar, hesitant. The footsteps stopped. My eyes flew open. I leaned over the railing into the dark stairwell, and there he was, a man I'd never seen before. Mid-30s, messy hair, eyes avoiding mine. He looked scared too. Police officers stormed through the front door seconds later, shouting commands. They cuffed the man. He kept apologizing, the words tumbling out. Turns out he had broken into the house not to rob or hurt me, but just to escape someone he claimed was after him. The officers found out he had been living rough nearby and had been on the run, desperate and confused, picking houses at random. I was shaking partly from the fever and partly from relief when the police told me it was safe, that he was caught and being taken away. Mom called in a panic, and I told her everything, every sound, every moment of fear. Later at the hospital, the doctor confirmed I had a severe flu, probably the worst case that season, which explained why I was so out of it. When I think back, the scariest part wasn't the intruder. It was how sick and foggy I was, how my own body tried to convince me I was imagining everything. I kept doubting what I felt and heard until it was almost too late to trust myself. Fever can mess with your head, sure, but sometimes your senses are warning you for real. You just have to listen. And that day, being sick nearly made me ignore the one thing I needed most, my own voice telling me something was wrong. The nurse who wasn't assigned to me. When I was 24, living alone in a small rental house about 20 minutes from my parents' place, I caught a stomach virus, or so I thought at first. It started with some mild nausea, which I blamed on that questionable takeout I'd had the night before. I figured it was just food poisoning and would clear up quickly. But then the vomiting got worse and wouldn't stop. After 2 days of retching, dehydration, dizziness, and feeling weaker by the hour, my mother convinced me to go to urgent care. I was reluctant at first. I hate hospitals and clinics, the smell, the sterile air, the way everyone always seems in a hurry or worried. But my mom was insistent, and honestly, I felt myself slipping. That afternoon, she drove me to the closest urgent care center, a brick building with a small parking lot in a strip mall. It was busy inside, but the waiting area had plenty of seats, and I sat down on a hard plastic chair as my mom filled out some forms. After about an hour, my name was called. A nurse in scrubs led me back into an examination room, dimly lit and cold. She was a middle-aged woman with close-cropped gray hair and gentle eyes. At first she seemed professional, but friendly, asking routine questions. How long had I been vomiting? If I had any other symptoms. Fever, diarrhea, abdominal pain. I answered as best I could through the dryness and dizziness. She took my blood pressure and pulse, jotting notes on a clipboard. Then she said I looked dehydrated and suggested they give me IV fluids. That sounded like a good idea. She left the room and shortly came back with a small portable IV stand. Here's where things started to feel off. I noticed the nurse didn't introduce herself, even though I had asked her name as she first came in. She just said, "I'll get this started," and never mentioned anything else. Also, the gloves she put on looked a little discolored, as if they were old or dirty. I remember thinking that was strange, but I was too out of it to really question it. She found a vein in my arm and inserted the IV needle with practiced ease. Then she attached the fluid bag and started the drip. I lay back, feeling some relief as cool liquid entered my veins, easing the dizzy spells. At some point, the doctor came in, checked my vitals, listened to my abdomen, and told me I was severely dehydrated, but would likely recover quickly with fluids and rest. Everything seemed to be going as expected. My mom was sitting beside me, watching quietly. Then the nurse said something odd. "You're going to feel a bit sleepy," she said softly. "The fluids sometimes make that happen. Just relax." I nodded, but then I noticed she stayed lingering in the room, sitting on a chair next to me in a way that didn't feel professional. Too close, almost like a visitor chatting to a friend, rather than a nurse to a patient. As the minutes passed, I began to feel my limbs grow heavy, my mind foggy, not just from the sickness, but from something else. I opened my eyes to ask a question, but the nurse was watching me with a strange, unreadable expression. My head pressed back against the bed, and I couldn't move as easily. My mom noticed too. She looked from me to the nurse with a frown, but said nothing at first. Suddenly, the nurse asked if I wanted a warm blanket. My mom nodded, and the nurse went out to get one. That's when my mom finally spoke up. "Excuse me, are you assigned to Rachel? I didn't see your name on the chart." The nurse came back, holding the blanket, and said, "Oh, I'm just helping out today. The assigned nurse is tied up with another patient." My mother's eyes narrowed. "Could you please let her know? We'd like to speak to the nurse in charge." The woman smiled, a thin smile. "Of course, just letting her know you're here." While the nurse covered me with the blanket, she slipped her phone out of her pocket and typed something quickly. I caught a glimpse of the screen. It was an app I didn't recognize, some kind of messaging or social media, maybe. Then the door burst open. Another nurse rushed in, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back and an official-looking badge clipped to her scrubs. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said firmly. "You're not assigned to this patient." The woman who had been sitting by me straightened up quickly, then muttered something about just helping out and getting the blankets. The younger nurse wasn't buying it. She looked at me and my mom intently, then pulled out her phone and made a call. Within minutes, security arrived and escorted the gray-haired woman out of the room, explaining that someone had reported a suspicious person posing as a nurse. My mom and the younger nurse helped me sit up and gather my things. I was still weak, but grateful to be out of that claustrophobic room. Later, the police showed up at the urgent care center. They had been alerted to an imposter nurse who had worked in several clinics under false credentials, falsifying patient records and in some cases, stealing medications. I gave my statement, shaky but clear. The woman who had cared for me was not licensed. She wasn't even supposed to be there. That night back at my rental house, the feeling of unease settled deep in my chest. I kept replaying the afternoon over and over, how sick I was, how I hadn't thought to question the stranger touching my arm, changing my fluids. I never got a clear answer why she did what she did. She'd been arrested, yes, but her motives were murky. No supernatural forces, no grand plan, just a desperate, dangerous fraud who took advantage of a sick young woman's vulnerability. I still shudder sometimes when I think about it. When you're sick, especially really sick, you trust people in a way that sometimes borders on blind faith. You drop your guard, forgetting how strange it is to let a complete stranger poke needles into your skin, pour liquids into your veins, and tell you what to do. I'm healthier now. I go to clinics and hospitals when I need to. But I never forget the day the nurse who wasn't assigned to me sat by my bedside, and how the smallest odd detail, if I'd noticed it in time, might have saved me from so much fear. That experience taught me to trust, but also to be careful. Because sickness doesn't just make your body vulnerable, it can make you give away your safety in ways you never imagined.